The savanna had already begun to close in on her when the sound reached her ears. It was not the thunderous roar people imagine when they think of lions. It was thinner, sharper, a desperate, broken sound, half cry, half rasp, carried by the dry wind across the tall grass, the kind of sound that didn't belong to the open plains at dawn, the kind that made every instinct in her body scream that something had gone terribly wrong. She froze mid-step. The sun was still low, stretching long shadows across the earth, turning the grass into a sea of flickering gold. This was supposed to be a routine morning, a brief survey walk before the heat became unbearable. She had done this dozens of times before. Alone, yes, but never reckless. She knew these lands, or at least she believed she did. The sound came again, closer this time. Her pulse spiked so hard she felt it in her throat. She scanned the horizon, every muscle tightening, aware of how small and exposed she was. There was no vehicle nearby, no radio signal strong enough to trust, just the vast openness of the savanna, and the knowledge that if a pride was anywhere close, she would never see them before it was too late. She should have turned back. Every rule, drilled into her mind over the years, told her to leave, walk away. Do not investigate. Do not follow sounds that do not belong. Curiosity gets people killed out here. But this wasn't curiosity, it was urgency. The cry rose again, ragged, now trembling, unmistakably young. Not a roar, not a warning, a cub. Her breath caught. Lion cubs did not cry alone. A cub without its mother meant only two possibilities, and both were deadly. Either the mother was close, watching, waiting, or she was gone, and if she was gone, the prey would not be far. The grass ahead rustled. Her heart slammed so violently she thought she might faint. She crouched instinctively, fingers digging into the coarse soil, eyes straining to catch movement. Seconds stretched into something unbearable. The air felt thick, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Then she saw it. A small shape stumbled into view. No more than a few weeks old. Its fur was matted with blood and dust. One hind leg dragged uselessly behind it, tangled in something dark and unnatural against the tawny earth. Why, the cub collapsed. For a moment, she forgot how to breathe. The trap was crude but effective. Rusted metal wire cinched tight around the tiny leg, cutting deep, already swollen, already infected. Poacher's work left behind like a forgotten curse in the grass. The cub pawed weakly at the wire, a thin whimper escaping its throat, each movement tightening the loop further into flesh. She felt sick. This was the moment where fear and instinct collided. Hidden, she was close enough now to see the cub's sides fluttering rapidly, exhaustion overtaking pain, close enough to know that if she did nothing it would die. Not quickly, slowly, terrified, alone, and close enough to understand the full horrifying truth. The mother could return at any second. Her hands shook as she reached for the knife at her belt. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to think, to calculate escape routes, but there were none. That savanna was wide and merciless. If the pride came, she would not outrun them. If the mother came and saw her touching the cub, there would be no warning, just impact, teeth, darkness. The cub lifted its head. Its eyes met hers. There was no understanding there, no trust, only pain and instinct. But there was also something else. Raw animal fear, the kind that recognized another living being in front of it and clung to the smallest chance of survival. Her decision happened before she could name it. She moved. Every second felt amplified, sharpened to the edge of panic. She dropped to her knees beside the cub, hands moving faster than thought, fingers slick with blood as she tried to assess the wire. It was deeper than she feared. Each breath the cub took made the metal bite harder. The grass behind her shifted, her spine locked. She did not look. She couldn't tee. Her ears strained for any sound. Footsteps, a low growl, the rumble of a lioness calling her cub. Nothing, only the wind, only the cub's broken cries. Only her own breathing, loud and controlled. She pressed the blade carefully against the wire, praying it wouldn't snap back into the cub's flesh. The knife slipped. Her hands were shaking too badly. She forced herself to slow down, to breathe, even as terror clawed at her throat. Another sound, closer. Her heart threatened to tear itself apart. She whispered without realizing she was doing it. Not words meant for the cub. Words meant for herself. Stay calm, stay alive, just a little longer. The wire gave way with a sharp metallic snap. The cub screamed, so did she. The sound cut through the morning like a signal flare. She knew it instantly. If there had been any chance of staying unseen, it was gone now. The cub thrashed weakly, blood seeping freely, its small body trembling beneath her hands. She scooped it up before she could stop herself. It was lighter than she expected to light, fragile in a way that made her chest ache. She pressed it against her instinct, overriding reason, turning her body into a shield without any plan for what came next. Then she heard it, a low vibrating sound that rolled through the ground. Before it reached her ears, a growl, not distant, not imagined, close enough to feel. Her blood turned to ice. She slowly lifted her head. The grass parted, and the savanna revealed what she had feared all along. Her name was Elena Ward, and in the silence that followed the growl, she understood with perfect clarity that this choice, this moment, would define the rest of her life, whether she survived the next few seconds or not. She did not move. The cub lay pressed against her chest, its breathing shallow, uneven, each rise of its ribs brushing against her skin. Its warmth was startling, real, alive. Elena could feel the frantic flutter of its heart through her shirt, a rhythm so fast it felt like it might burst. Instinct told her to put the cub down, immediately to step back, to raise her hands and retreat slowly. Every training manual she had ever read echoed in her head like a warning bell. Do not stand between a lioness and her cub. But Elena stayed where she was, not because she was brave in the way people imagine bravery, not because she believed she could outmatch what stood before her. She stayed because when she looked down at the small broken body in her arms, survival stopped being the only thing that mattered. The lioness stepped fully into view. She was massive, her frame lean, but powerful, muscles shifting beneath scarred skin as she moved. Her eyes were locked on Elena with a focus so sharp it felt like being pinned in place. This was not blind rage. This was assessment, calculation, the kind of stillness that precedes absolute violence. Elena's mouth went dry. She did not raise the knife. She did not shout. She did not run. Instead, she did something quieter. She lowered herself slowly to the ground, knees sinking into the dirt, making her body smaller, not larger. She adjusted her grip on the cub, not tightening, not hiding it, but angling it so the lioness could see, so she could understand. The cub whimpered again, a thin sound that cut through the heavy air. The lioness's ears flicked forward. Elena felt something inside her chest fracture open. The grief on the animal's face was unmistakable now. Not just anger, not just threat. Fear, confusion, a mother searching for something that should never have been lost. I am not taking him, Elena whispered, her voice barely more than breath. She didn't know why she spoke. The lioness could not understand the words, but perhaps she could understand the tone, the stillness, the lack of challenge. Her hands trembled as she shifted the cub slightly, exposing the injured leg, the deep cut where the wear had been. Blood still seeped slowly dark against the pale fur. The cub's eyes were half closed now, exhaustion overtaking pain. Elena swallowed hard. He was dying. She whispered the words, meant as much for herself as for the animal in front of her. I couldn't leave him. The lioness took a step closer. Elena's body reacted before her mind could stop it. Her muscles tensed, every nerve screaming to flee. She forced herself to stay still, even as fear flooded her veins. She had never been this close to death, and this come at the same time. This was the part no one talked about when they spoke of conservation, the moments when theory collapsed under reality, when the lines between observer and participant vanished completely, when you realize that compassion once chosen could not be undone without destroying something essential inside you. Elena had come to the savanna years ago after losing everything that once anchored her life, a career she had believed would last forever, a relationship that ended not in betrayal but in quiet erosion. She had arrived here thinking distance would dull pain, that purpose could be found in data and patrol routes and reports. But the savanna had taught her something else, that life did not move in clean lines, that survival was not always the highest good, that sometimes meaning was forged in moments where logic failed and only instinct remained. The lioness stopped a few feet away. They were close enough now that Elena could see the individual scars across her muzzle. Old wounds, old battles, proof that this mother had already fought more than most creatures ever would. The lioness lowered her head slightly, eyes never leaving the cub. Elena slowly shifted forward, placing the cub gently onto the ground between them. Her movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial. She did not let go immediately. Her hands hovered there for it, a moment, reluctant, afraid that once she released him, something irreversible would happen. The cub stirred weakly, confused by the change in warmth. Elena withdrew her hands. Time stretched. The lioness approached, every step measured, cautious. She sniffed the air, the cub, the blood, her body tense, then stilled again. She nudged the cub gently with her nose. The cub let out a faint sound and pressed instinctively toward her. Elena's breath hitched. This was it. This was the moment where she would either be forgotten or destroyed. There was no space left for control, only acceptance. The lioness did not attack. Instead, she lay down, not fully, not relaxed, but enough to shield the cub with her body, to place herself between him and Elena. Her eyes remained on the woman, not hostile now, but wary, protective. Elena felt tears spill before she realized she was crying. She did not wipe them away. She remained kneeling, hands open, showing nothing but emptiness. She had nothing left to offer, no tools, no solutions, only the fact that she had chosen the cub's life over her own safety, and that choice now hung in the air between predator and human. Minutes passed. The sun climbed higher, warming the ground, softening the sharp edges of the morning. Birds resumed their calls, cautiously, as if the world itself was unsure whether it was allowed to continue. Elena's legs began to ache. Her arms trembled with exhaustion. She did not shift. She did not look away. The lioness eventually lowered her head to groom the cub, tongue rasping gently over blooded fur. Each stroke was careful, precise, maternal. The cub's breathing began to slow to steady. Only then did Elena allow herself to exhale fully, She rose slowly, one aching joint at a time, backing away. With deliberate care, she did not turn her back until she had put several meters between herself and the pair. The lioness watched her go, not with hatred, not with gratitude, with memory. Elena did not know then that this moment would follow her long after the dust had settled, that the choice she made would ripple outward in ways she could not imagine. She only knew that she had walked into the savanna, prepared to study life, and instead had been asked to protect it with her own, and she had said yes, even when survival begged her to say no. Elena did not leave the savanna that morning. She told herself that once the cub was back in his mother's care, the only sensible thing was to retreat, to put distance between her fragile human body and the territory she had just crossed without permission. Every instinct honed by years of field work urged her to go. The land had granted her a narrow mercy. She would be foolish to test it further. But when she took a step back, the ground felt unfamiliar beneath her boots, as if the savanna itself had shifted. She paused. The lioness remained where she was, the cub tucked against her chest, now sheltered by the curve of her body. The animal's eyes never left Elena. They were no longer sharp with threat, but they were not soft either. They were watchful, measuring. This was not the end of the story. Elena understood that with the same clarity she had felt earlier when fear had drained from her body and left something heavier in its place. She had crossed a line that did not simply disappear because she walked away. The cub lived. The wire was gone, but the pride the rest of them had not yet weighed in, and they would. The wind shifted. Elena felt at first on the back of her neck a subtle change in temperature, a disturbance that carried scent and sound. The lioness felt it, too. Her body stiffened, head lifting slightly as her ears turned, catching movements Elena could not yet see. Then Elena heard it. Footsteps, not rushed, not chaotic, heavy, deliberate, spaced with the confidence of animals that knew exactly where they were going. The pride was returning. Elena's heart began to pound again, slower, this time deeper. This was not the sharp panic of moments before. This was dread, the kind that settles into the bones and refuses to leave. She scanned the horizon and saw them emerging from the tall grass, one by one. 3 lionesses, first, their coats darker, their movements synchronized as if guided by a shared rhythm. Then the male, massive and unmistakable, his mane catching the light as he stepped into view. He was older, his face lined with scars that told a story of years spent fighting to hold what was his. They stopped when they saw her. The air seemed to freeze. Elena stood alone in the open now, no cover, no retreat that would not trigger pursuit. She could feel her pulse in her throat. Her hands curled slowly into fists, and then relaxed again. She forced herself to breathe. The male lion stared at her. There was no confusion in his gaze, only judgment. Elena knew what the pride saw, an intruder standing where no human belonged, too close to something precious, something vulnerable. They did not know about the wire. They did not know about the blood or the hours the cub had spent trapped and crying. They saw only the aftermath. A cub that smelled wrong, a mother tense and alert, a human who should not be there. The lioness with the cub rose to her feet. She placed herself between Elena and the pride, body angled, tail flicking sharply against her flank. It was not an aggressive stance, but it was not submission either. It was assertion. Mine. The cub pressed against her legs, and steady but alive. The male lion took a step forward. The sound he made was low, and resonant, vibrating through Elena's chest. It was not a roar, it was a warning. Her legs threatened to give way. Beneath her, she did not move. Elena did. The only thing left to her, she stood still and let the truth of her presence speak for itself. She lowered her eyes, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. She kept her hands visible, empty. She did not reach for anything, did not turn away, did not run. Running would mean death, but so might staying. The male lion circled slowly, his movements unhurried, powerful, each step closed the distance between them by inches that felt enormous. Elena could smell and now the wild metallic scent of muscle and earth and old blood. Her mind screamed at her to prepare for impact, for pain, for the end. Instead, something else surfaced. Memory. She thought of the cub tangled in wire, of the way his body had trembled against hers. She thought of the moment the lioness had laid down instead of attacking, choosing presence over violence. She thought of how survival in this place was not just about strength, but about judgment. She met the male lioness gaze. It was a mistake by every rule she knew, but it was honest. The lion stopped. He was close enough now that Elena could see the pale marks along his muzzle, that slight cloudiness in one eye. He looked past her briefly toward the cub, then back to her face. The lioness let out a sound Elena had never heard before, soft, controlled, unmistakably communicative. She nudged the cub forward slightly, then positioned herself again, standing firm. The message was clear. This human touched him, but she did not take him. The prey shifted. One of the other lionesses moved closer, lowering her head to sniff the cub. Another circled Elena at a wider distance, her gaze cold and assessing. The air crackled with tension, so thick Elena felt she might choke on it. The male lion inhaled deeply. Elena realized then that this was not a trial of strength, but of meaning. The prey was deciding not whether she could be killed, they could end her in seconds, but whether she needed to be. She had no way to argue, no way to explain, only her stillness, her refusal to flee, her presence stripped of threat. The lioness with the cub lay down again. It was a small movement, a subtle one, but it changed everything. The male lion exhaled slowly and stepped back, not far, just enough. Elena's knees nearly buckled with relief. She did not dare show the pride, did not relax. They did not welcome her. They did not acknowledge her as anything other than what she was, an anomaly, a human who had stepped into their world and inexplicably not caused harm. Minutes passed like hours. Then the male lion turned away. One by one, the others followed, melting back into the grass, their bodies disappearing with the same quiet confidence with which they had arrived. The lioness with the cub remained last, watching Elena until the very end. When she finally turned, Elena felt the weight lift from her chest. Only then did Elena realize how close she had come to dying. She sank slowly to her knees, hands pressed into the dirt, her breath coming in ragged waves. Her body shook, not from fear now, but from the release of something immense. She had stood in the center of a judgment she did not belong to and had been spared, not because she was powerful, not because she was important, but because she had chosen compassion when it offered her no protection. All as she eventually stood and backed away, careful not to turn her back until distance separated them. Elena knew one thing with absolute certainty: the pride had not spared her by accident. They had spared her because for one brief moment she had acted not as a human intruder, but as something the savanna recognized, someone who protected what was fragile, and that in a world ruled by tooth and claw was not weakness. It was a language older than fear. Elena did not leave immediately. Even after the pride had vanished into the tall grass, even after the savanna resumed its slow-breathing rhythm, she remained where she was standing, in the place where her life could have ended. The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense, layered, alive with meaning. It pressed against her ears and settled into her chest, heavier than the roar she had expected, but never heard. She listened. The grass whispered again. Insects resumed their steady hum. Somewhere far off, a bird called, tentative at first, then confident. The land was not celebrating her survival. It was simply continuing, indifferent and ancient as it always had. Elena took a step back, then another, careful to move slowly, deliberately, the way one does when leaving a sacred space. She did not turn her back until distance softened the outlines of where the pride had stood. Only then did she allow herself to breathe deeply. Her lungs burned. It was strange, after everything, after the nearness of death and the unbearable tension of being judged by something so far beyond human rules. What overwhelmed her most was not fear, it was humility, a quiet, sobering awareness of how small she was in the vast logic of the wild. She walked until her legs trembled, then stopped and sat on a flat stone beneath a lone acacia. The shade felt unreal against her skin. Her hands were still shaking. She stared at them, flexing her fingers as if to reassure herself they were still hers. Silence stretched, and in that silence, Elena understood something she had never learned from textbooks or field manuals. The lions had spoken, not with sound, but with restraint, with assessment, with choice. They had read her not as a threat, not as prey, but as a variable, something unfamiliar, but not automatically dangerous. And the wild, that distinction meant everything. She stayed there for a long time, replaying each moment in her mind, the lioness placing herself between her and the pride, the male's measured approach, the way the cub had leaned instinctively into its mother as protection. That savanna had not needed words. It had communicated through posture, breath, distance, and stillness, and she had answered by doing nothing, by refusing to flee, by refusing to dominate, by refusing to claim anything that did not belong to her. When Elena finally stood again, the sun had climbed higher. Heat shimmered across the plains, erasing the sharp edges of the morning. She began the long walk back to her vehicle, each step grounding her, reminding her that she was still here, still breathing. The drive away felt surreal. She kept glancing in the rear view mirror, half expecting to see a shape emerge from the grass, a reminder that the boundary between safety and danger was thinner than she had ever imagined. But nothing followed her. The savanna closed behind her as if she had never been there at all. At camp, the world felt wrong. The voices of colleagues, the clatter of equipment, the casual talk of schedules and data, it all felt distant, muted, as if she were moving through water. She answered questions automatically, offering only the necessary details. A cub had been injured, the wire had been removed, the situation had resolved itself. No one pressed. How could she explain what had truly happened? That she had stood in the presence of animals capable of killing her instantly, and had been spared not out of mercy, as humans defined it, but out of recognition that something ancient had weighed her actions and found them acceptable. That silence had spoken louder than any scream. That night, Elena lay awake in her tent, listening to the distant sounds of the savanna under starlight. Lions roared far off, their voices rolling across the darkness like thunder. She did not flinch this time. Instead, she felt an ache in her chest that surprised her. Not longing, not fear, gratitude. In the days that followed, she returned to her work, but she was changed in ways she could not immediately articulate. She found herself moving more slowly, observing more carefully. She spoke less when among the animals, allowing quiet to do the work words could not. She never returned to the site where she had freed the cub. Some places she knew now were not meant to be revisited. They existed as moments, not destinations. Weeks later, during a routine patrol, a colleague mentioned spotting a lion cub running alongside a pride, clumsy but determined, no injuries visible, no signs of distress. Elena said nothing, but her hands tightened briefly on the steering wheel. She did not need confirmation the cub had survived. That knowledge settled into her gently, without triumph. She did not feel pride. She felt relief and something deeper still, a sense that the story no longer belonged to her. It never really had. The world moved on. Reports were written. Conservation meetings were held. Data points were logged and archived. Life continued with its familiar demands, but silence stayed with her. She began to understand that silence was not absence. It was attention. It was the space in which decisions formed before action, the space the pride had occupied while judging her, the space she had stepped into when she chose to kneel instead of run. Months later, when asked to speak to a group of new field researchers, Elena found herself saying something unexpected. Out there, she told them, you think survival is about knowing what to do. Most of the time, it is about knowing when not to do anything at all. They looked at her puzzled. She didn't elaborate. Some lessons could not be taught. They had to be lived, absorbed in. Moments where silence became a language and survival depended on listening. On her final morning in the reserve, Elena rose before dawn and stepped outside as the sky softened from black to blue. The land stretched before her, vast and indifferent to hand, impossibly beautiful. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. She imagined the lioness somewhere out there, the cub growing stronger with each day, the pride moving as one through the tall grass. She imagined the silent understanding that had passed between species, unrecorded, unmeasured, yet real. Then she opened her eyes and turned back toward camp. She carried no proof of what had happened, no photographs, no footage, no evidence that would satisfy a skeptic. What she carried instead was quieter and far more permanent, the knowledge that sometimes in the most dangerous places on Earth, survival is not claimed, it is granted, and sometimes the greatest conversation you will ever have happens without a single word being spoken. What lingered after the lions disappeared was not relief in the way Elena had expected. It was not the sudden collapse of fear, not the rush of adrenaline breaking free. It was something quieter, heavier, and far more difficult to name. It followed her like a second shadow, subtle but constant, reshaping the way she moved through the world long after the grass had closed behind the pride. In the days that followed, Elena noticed how ordinary things felt strangely altered. The clink of metal tools sounded sharper. The chatter of colleagues felt distant, as if spoken through a thin wall. Even the colors of the savanna seemed more deliberate, less decorative, more purposeful. Everything appeared to exist exactly as it needed to, without excess or apology. She carried the memory of that encounter, not as a story she replayed, but as a presence she lived with. It surfaced when she paused before acting, when instinct urged speed, but something deeper advised stillness. It surfaced when she caught herself speaking too much, filling silence that no longer needed to be filled. The lions had walked away, but they had left behind a measure, not a debt, not a bond, a measure of restraint, of judgment, of balance. Elena realized that what unsettled her most was how little the moment had been about her, and that stories people like to tell humans were always the center, heroes or victims, saviors or fools. But in the savannah, that morning, she had been none of those things. She had simply been another presence, another factor weighed by a system far older than intention or morality, and that somehow was liberating. She began to understand how much of human life was built on no's, on explanation, justification, control. We spoke to assert meaning, to prove existence, to avoid uncertainty. The lions had needed none of that. They had assessed, decided, and moved on. No drama, no memory-making, no need to turn survival into a narrative. What stayed with Elena was the humility of that truth. Weeks passed, then months. The season shifted. Grass grew taller, then brittle. The rhythms of the reserve continued, indifferent to individual moments. Elena returned to routine. Patrols, data collection, long drives, under relentless sun. On the surface, nothing had changed. But internally, everything had. She found herself advocating differently in meetings, arguing not for action, but for patience, for observation, for allowing systems to resolve themselves when possible. She spoke of intervention as a responsibility, not a right, something earned through understanding rather than urgency. Some colleagues listened, others didn't. That no longer bothered her. She had learned that approval was not the measure of correctness. Survival was not proof of virtue, and silence, when respected, could teach more than any explanation. There were nights when she dreamed of the cub, not as it had been tangled in wire and fear, but as it might be now, running, stumbling, growing into its strength. In those dreams the pride moved without urgency, their cohesion effortless, their confidence absolute. She was never part of those dreams. She watched from a distance, unseen and unacknowledged, and she was content with that. On her final day in the reserve, before rotating back home, Elena stood alone at dawn, the horizon unfolding in layers of golden gray. The land felt immense, but no longer hostile. It felt honest, uncompromising, yes, but fair in its own way. She thought about the woman she had been before that rescue, skilled, cautious, confident. She had believed that knowledge was protection, that preparation guaranteed safety. She understood now that knowledge was only a doorway. What lay beyond it required something rare, humility in the face of forces that did not care whether you understood them. The lions had not spared her because she was brave or kind or useful. They had spared her because in that moment she had not violated the balance. That realization stripped away something she had not known she carried, a quiet arrogance inherited from being human, from believing that intelligence entitled her to outcomes. In its place grew a steadier awareness that coexistence was not built on dominance or sentiment, but on respect for boundaries, even when they were invisible. When Elena finally left the reserve, she did so without ceremony, no final look back, no attempt to imprint the landscape into memories. Some experiences she had learned were not meant to be preserved like photographs. They lived best when allowed to dissolve into who you became. Back home, life resumed with familiar comforts and distractions. Friends asked about her work. She offered measured answers. She spoke of ecosystems, conservation, risk management. She did not speak of lions, standing in silence weighing her life, without hatred or mercy, not because she feared disbelief, but because the truth of it had nothing to gain from being believed. What stayed after the lambs walked away was not a lesson she could teach or a warning she could issue. It was a shift subtle but irreversible in how she understood her place in the world, not above it, not apart from it, simply within it, subject to its rules. Whether she acknowledged them or not, she carried that understanding into every decision afterward, into every pause before action, into every moment when fear tempted her to rush or ego tempted her to claim importance, and sometimes late at night when the world was quiet enough, she felt it again, that deep attentive stillness, the kind that does not demand response, the kind that listens first. She knew then that what had stayed was not the memory of danger, but the memory of restraint, of a choice made without words, without drama, without obligation, a reminder that survival at its most profound is not about being spared. It is about being recognized and knowing when to step back so the world can continue without you. What remains after this story is not the image of lion standing in silence, nor the tension of a woman surrounded by power she could never control. What truly endures is the quiet transformation that took place within that moment and what it teaches us about how we move through the world, often without realizing the weight of our choices. This story reminds us that the most meaningful encounters in life are rarely loud. They do not announce themselves with triumph or tragedy. Instead, they arrive quietly, demanding something far more difficult than courage or strength. They demand humility. Elena did not survive because she was fearless. She survived because she understood, perhaps instinctively, that not every situation is meant to be conquered in a world that constantly tells us to push forward, to dominate obstacles, to win at all costs. This moment offers a different truth. Sometimes the bravest tact is knowing when to stop. The lions did not respond to her intentions, her emotions, or her identity. They responded to balance, to restraint, to respect, and that is a powerful lesson for our own lives. How often do we rush into situations believing that good intentions alone are enough? How often do we speak when silence would be wiser, act when patience would be safer, insist when understanding would be stronger? This story challenges us to reconsider those instincts. It asks us to reflect on how often we mistake urgency for importance and control for wisdom. Another profound message lies in the idea of coexistence. The lions were not villains, nor were they heroes. They were simply what they were, guardians of a system older than human language or morality. Elena was allowed to remain not because she was special, but because she did not disrupt that system. That realization can feel unsettling. It strips away the comforting belief that the world revolves around us, but it is also deeply liberating when we stop trying to place ourselves at the center of every story. We begin to listen more. We observe more. We learn more. The story also reminds us that compassion does not always look dramatic. Saving the cub was an act of kindness, yes, but it was also an act of responsibility. True compassion does not seek recognition. It does not demand gratitude. It acts because something fragile deserves a chance to continue. And perhaps the most inspiring lesson of all is this: not every meaningful experience is meant to be retold loudly. Some moments are meant to change us quietly and permanently. Elena did not leave the savannah with a trophy or a tale meant to impress. She left with perspective, and that is far more valuable. Perspective teaches us to pause before reacting, to measure our presence before asserting it. 2. Understand that being human does not place us above the world, but within it. When we learn that our choices become gentler, our actions become more deliberate, and our impact, though quieter, becomes far deeper. This story is not just about wildlife. It is about how we treat fear, power, and responsibility in our own lives. It is about learning that respect can be stronger than force and silence can speak louder than command. If this story moved you, made you reflect, or reminded you of the quiet strength that exists in compassion and restraint, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel is made for. By subscribing, you help us continue sharing stories that don't just entertain, but inspire, challenge, and reconnect us with the deeper truths of humanity and nature. Your support gives these stories a voice and allows us to keep bringing meaningful content to life. If you believe that stories can change how we see the world, if you believe that empathy still matters, then join us, subscribe, stay with us, and let us continue exploring the moments that remind us who we truly are, because sometimes the most powerful stories are not about what happened next, but about what stayed with us forever.